Coming up on this week's episode of Needed Conversations.
We're talking about boundaries, betrayal, and building back trust.
I think oftentimes what we see in our counseling session with couples that are dealing with severe betrayal and now having to rebuild trust issues, I feel like they wait way too long to ask for help. And it's almost like counseling becomes an okay for them to proceed forward to the next step.
Disclosure versus discovery. When we look at the success rates of those who experience infidelity, where there's disclosure instead of discovery, there's a greater chance of reconciliation.
Disclosure is when a spouse actually comes to you and says, hey, I've struggled with this, whether it's pornography or an affair or infidelity or whatever it is that they have walked through, versus somebody discovering that my
Text
spouse have been
messages,
cheating, and now I'm seeing all of these little things, almost kind of like these little nuggets that I'm following along, and I'm like, have I been blind to all of this? And that can be even more devastating. So then once you confront your spouse, it's no longer like them opening up to you. It's like they've been caught.
Boundaries does not equal punishment. I would always message Victoria, hey, just arrived, getting into the car. Hey, just arrived at the hotel. Made sure there was all kinds of over communicating that was going on. Some of these boundaries are going to be uber extreme, especially in the interim, until trust is built. And other measures are just going to have to be put in place for the rest of your life.
Yeah, for sure.
Real repentance equates to changing the way that you think and allowing that to change your behavior. It's not just about words.
Is this stemming from my previous hurt? And so now I'm compounding this rejection, and I'm walking through these issues with my spouse because I've experienced so much rejection. So now my response to what they did is so extreme because of my previous relationships and how I've managed them.
I know this is a random story, and I don't even know if you want to share it. We can cut it out if you want, but I don't know if you remember one time when we were in Georgia and we were walking down the mall and some guy grabbed you on the butt and you just had this visceral reaction, and we're standing in front of him and we realized that he's... Welcome back to our series, When Love Gets Tough, Fighting, Forgiving, and Finding Intimacy. Wow, this has been a great series. We've covered a lot of good topics. What have you gotten from it all so far, Victoria?
I mean, we got tests and trials. That's what we got.
Not for us. Actually, we've been pretty good.
This week's was pretty good, but I'm talking about the series in general.
Oh, okay.
I just want people to know that, listen, we are giving you guys all of these practical tools, but we are in the same boat. We're walking through it as well. And it's okay that you hit friction points. You have some tense moments of, what do we call it? Intense fellowship.
Yeah, that's the kind way of saying it.
Or the wrestling, because life goes on. This is the closest person to you. And there are going to be disputes. And for those of the people that tell you that fights are not normal, that means that you're close to divorce, it's just a lie. We all experience relational issues, and we're just wanting to give you guys pointers on how to overcome those tough times.
Yeah. Well, today we're going to get a little bit tougher.
Yep.
Because we're talking about boundaries, betrayal, and building back trust. Last week we talked about forgiveness and why that's an important part of the healing process. But today we're going to go a little bit deeper, helping you all, especially the ones who are dealing with some more challenging, traumatic situations, to help restore the marriage that you have, and that God can get glory out of your trial. And for those of you who have not gone through this still may be a great episode for you to listen to help others, and also maybe spot some red flags. So to maybe be able to catch when your spouse is spiraling a little bit, and be able to have those important, needed conversations before things get out of control. But you know what? Make sure you're also following us on all of social media, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and guess what? This is a heavy conversation. So if at any point you need help, you need prayer, you want to set up a mediation session with my wife and I and your spouse, text us 864-428-7131. Just say, hey, I need help with my marriage, and we'll walk you through it. Also, there's always resources you can get from moremostforever.com, books, blogs, all of the above. So check it out.
Yeah, for sure.
So Victoria, today we're talking about betrayal. And is it really possible to rebuild trust? And the answer to that?
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely a way to rebuild trust, but it's going to take more than just an apology, for sure. You have to be very intentional, and both partners are going to have to be willing to work on it.
Yeah.
I think oftentimes what we see in our counseling session with couples that are dealing with severe betrayal and now having to rebuild trust issues, I feel like they wait way too long to ask for help, and it's almost like counseling becomes an okay for them to proceed forward to the next step. And we don't want you to get to that place. If you have experienced betrayal recently, we would highly encourage you to reach out to somebody. It doesn't have to be us. It could be somebody else trusted, a pastor or a counselor that specializes in those kind of things, to give you guys a different perspective, but also help you walk through this process. We've just seen so many people that have reached out early on and their success rate and how quickly they were able to recover versus somebody that during the rebuilding of the trust, the betrayer and the victim both suffered a lot.
Yeah. So I think that if you can find trusted resources, I think that's going to be key. And you know what? I'll say this. Most pastors are well-intentioned, but they're ill-equipped.
Yeah.
So that means that they are willing to give you whatever biblical knowledge they have as it relates to marriage. Some of them are struggling in their own marriage, and yet they're sitting with couples and they don't have the tools to give them. And I think that their main goal is to make sure that you guys stay together. And I think that that's a valiant desire, but that doesn't necessarily get to the root of the issue and help that couple build back once it's like a nuclear explosion that's been set off in your marriage. So I think we need to view our pastors in the right context and say they can be there for prayer, for support, even for accountability. I think that's really big.
Yeah.
But I think especially if you've dealt with infidelity or a huge betrayal of sorts, you're going to need someone with a little bit more expertise. And I would say, even though Victoria and I have not experienced infidelity in our marriage, we have certainly counseled many couples through it and have done a lot of research ourselves with experts in the field. So I think it would be good for us to help you if that's something you need.
Yeah, I know everybody is different and they're looking for maybe a person that has walked through the same situation, but I can tell you everybody's situation is very unique, and therefore the approach has to be unique. And I think what differentiates us from that is that we want to go back to the scripture also, but we want to deal with the root issue. And sometimes that means that you may need individual counseling. And I think sometimes that's kind of thrown under the bus. A lot of times it's pointed to the either betrayer or the victim, like you have to deal with this, you have to deal with this, versus let's go way back. Why, you have experienced all this. Why have you gone through this? Why is there this addiction? Because we want to walk you through a deliverance, and it takes time.
Yes.
And a process.
And I'm glad you brought that up, because sometimes it is an infidelity. Sometimes it is financial mistrust. Sometimes it's your spouse is racking up debt behind your back, or they have a shopping addiction. You would be surprised, but maybe not. Sometimes it's other kinds of addictions like substance abuse or pornography is a big issue that probably 9 out of every 10 couples are going to have to face. I find it rare that you find a couple who has not had that as an issue at some point or another.
And I would say the most recent one too is emotional affairs.
Yes,
because
true.
of social media, a lot of people just kind of almost unintentionally slide into that, where they subliminally now have these conversations through DMs or start sending these memes to the opposite sex. And then all of these conversations start kind of almost spiraling out of control. So we have seen a lot of that as well.
And I think you have to separate the conversation between what do you have to do as a couple to rebuild this marriage and to establish trust? And then what does each individual need to become a whole and healed individual? Because the reality is betrayal cuts deep. But the hope is that this doesn't have to be the end. Betrayal in marriage takes many forms, like we just laid out the most common of which is infidelity. That's the one that most people feel shakes the foundation of safety, intimacy, and honesty. And here's the first point that we want to lay out to you is that it's normal to feel devastated. Sometimes people feel shame about their scenario. They try to hide it, which also is a reason why they're not reaching out for help. But to say it's okay to feel sort of devastated about this situation, but then in the same breath realizing that it doesn't have to be the end of your story. In fact, studies show that 60 to 75% of marriages find recovery after infidelity with intentional work. And honestly speaking, we've had marriages that ended out better on the other side of it. We don't want to give credit to the infidelity, but maybe it was a catalyst for uncovering something else that was there below the surface and help that couple find greater level of intimacy and transparency and trust. Anything you want to add to that, Victoria?
No, I think we're on a good track here.
Yeah, one of the things Victoria brought to me this week is she was listening, doing her own research from a guy by the name of Jim Kress, is the importance of disclosure. Now, he lays out something called disclosure versus discovery, which when we look at the success rates of those who experience infidelity, where there's disclosure instead of discovery, there's a greater chance of reconciliation. And why don't you explain that just a little bit?
So disclosure is when a spouse actually comes to you and says, hey, I've struggled with this, and it's still devastating for sure to hear somebody to open up, whether it's pornography or an affair or infidelity or whatever it is that they have walked through. But it's a lot better, and statistics say that there's a lot more chances for your marriage to rebuild trust versus somebody discovering that my
Text
spouse have been
messages,
cheating, and now I'm seeing all of these little things, almost kind of like these little nuggets that I'm following along. And I'm like, have I been blind to completely all of this? And that can be even more devastating. So then once you confront your spouse, it's no longer like them opening up to you. It's like they've been caught.
Yeah.
You're just sorry you've been caught. That's one of the biggest statements that a lot of people say. You're not
and
really
then you're
sorry.
always thinking, what else is there that's not being told?
Right.
Whereas when there is disclosure, you feel a sort of confidence that that person is wrestling with their sin.
At least remorseful.
They have some remorse.
Yeah.
And I think on an individual level, I think that's what having a reprobate mind really is when the Bible talks about that.
That's good.
Is I believe that we can walk with anyone through all levels of struggle. We all have our thorn in the flesh, if you want to call it. But those who have let go of the struggle, the fighting, the wrestling with their soul, and have now started to believe that their behavior is
acceptable.
Yep. It is the way that it is. God made me this way. There's no escaping it. It's just human nature. When they start leaning into that, then they start creating patterns of belief and even theological positions around that behavior, which give them permission to continue in this pattern. And so I think that's key right off the bat. If you have a spouse, maybe it's because they were discovered, but their immediate response to you is, well, this is who I am. And I find this on the male side of things. Men will rise up and try to take dominance over their wife and say, listen, this is the nature of a man. We have certain
home,
needs.
So, yeah.
You weren't giving it to me the way that you should have. And so guess what? It happened. It's probably going to happen again. And guess what? You're just going to have to deal with it. Now you've moved into a place where there's abuse.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not physical. I mean, to a degree it is, but it's emotional. It's manipulation. Normally there's financial constraints upon that woman to be able to leave. That is when you definitely need to reach out for help. And that is when you need to find a pathway to escape the relationship, because that person is not going to change, at least not while you're in that situation. Now, we have watched people, men in particular, who through multiple marriages, at some point they finally get it, whether it's a transformation with Jesus and God helps them to repent and change the way that they think about it. And finally they are in this committed marriage and it looks like things are together. But majority of the time that's not going to be resolved in that first marriage until I'm not, excuse me. I don't want to just lay impossibilities out there because
God can do an amazing
God is the
work.
God of the
We have
impossible.
seen some incredible things that God has done in so many different couples, and they have walked through a lot.
But if there's a belief system
Yeah.
at play, until that mindset is cracked and conquered, it's going to be a very, very tough road ahead.
Both parties at the end of the day have to be willing to be able to work on that.
That's correct. So the other thing is where we see individuals, whether in marriage or just struggling in general, where they know that their behavior is wrong. They may not understand why they do it yet. It could be just unraveling their childhood and trauma and all of this. That there is hope, because that person they need the support. They need the framework to be able to make better decisions. And so that's why I feel like that disclosure is key, especially in those situations. And that when your spouse does disclose something, especially if it's like the first layer, let's say it's an emotional affair. I think that is a great sign. If they brought that out to you and say, hey, somebody reached out to me on Instagram. I started talking back and forth with them. I opened up, like I put my heart on the line. I even contemplated meeting up with them. That's a good sign that they're willing to come to you. Now, definitely there's work to be done, but the very fact that they brought it to you, if your immediate reaction is at a 10, you're probably going to push them into
Maybe even making that decision to continue forward.
Or maybe if it's not right then, they definitely will think twice the next time they're struggling or even thinking these thoughts, with like giving it to you to hold them accountable. So there's a bit of a balancing act. I think that you have to measure each instance as it is. I would say, especially with pornography, that is something that is ingrained within our society. It's everywhere we look, and social media, the algorithms are designed to loop you into these places where you end up going to a site or looking at things that maybe when you first logged onto your phone or your app that you wouldn't have necessarily went there directly. So there's a lot of grace that we have to give. It's definitely not acceptable behavior.
Right.
But it's certainly behavior that could be worked through. And we're not sitting here putting sin on a scale, right? Because I believe that if you are sinning in a small infraction, whether it be an emotional affair or pornography, or you've committed adultery, sin is sin, and it's all weighed the same in terms of the blood of Jesus being able to cover it. I think where the difference lies is in whether it's self-destructive behavior or maybe affecting a small perimeter, or whether it's seeped out into affecting your spouse and other people in a greater way. Like whenever you move into infidelity and you're sleeping with another person and then you sleep with your spouse again, you're putting them in physical danger of STDs, bacterial infections, and so on top of the emotional betrayal, on top of the lies and all of that.
Yeah, it's like a covenant breaking. It's pretty devastating. And again, we want to preface all this, like we want to give you guys all these pointers, and we don't want to give anybody an excuse to just kind of like, yeah, this is my situation, exit, bye. Because we do want to talk about reconciliation. There is a big percentage of people that will survive that.
Yes.
Even though they walk through such major trials. We've seen people pray for their spouse for years and years and years, and it doesn't happen overnight. It's not like a week's journey, a month's journey, or I've heard people say, well, yeah, we came, we counseled, it changed for like 2 months, and then it went back to the same thing. And again, when you deal with the root of the issue, especially on an individual basis, that tree is going to take time to dismantle, and that root system to be uprooted and then replaced with something new. Yeah. So this is why we even encourage individual counseling on that aspect for the victim, but also for the one who has struggled with a specific kind of addiction or affair or any of that.
And if it's not a habitual adultery, like we've obviously heard of cases where the spouse has cheated with so many people that they can't even keep count. That's one level. And then, of course, there's the one-off situation, a coworker, it doesn't look habitual. I think there's a different way of approaching it and understanding, while you aren't responsible for your spouse's behavior, to be able to recognize the gaps in your relationship that can be filled in order to prevent those situations from happening in the future. I hope that makes sense. Yeah. Anything you want to add to discovery and disclosure, Victoria?
No, I think that's good.
Yeah. So what does forgiveness and trust restoration actually look like? So as we talked about last week, forgiveness is that immediate act of obedience to God to let them go, to trust God in spite of the pain that you feel, in order to let go of the debt that you want to hold over your spouse's head. Now, trust is different. Trust is rebuilt through time, consistency, and accountability. And reconciliation is really a term of accounting. Anybody who's done their taxes, this is that time of year, you know what it means when the books are balanced. And to be able to say, this is what it cost me, and to tally that up and be able to let them go for every single debt that has accrued because of their betrayal. But the trust aspect in building a relationship that is strong and healthy is going to happen through time, through consistent behavior, and through accountability. Forgiveness releases them from the offense, but trust is earned back over time through transparency. Now, one of the keys to building this trust is boundaries. And one of the things that I want to make sure you understand about boundaries is that boundaries does not equal punishment. So if there's any type of punishment going on, then that takes us back to, was there true forgiveness? But when we start conflating boundaries with punishment, then that spouse who feels the imposition of these new restrictions, so to speak, may try to gaslight their spouse into believing that they're being punished when that's not the case. Right.
And I also want to preface and say that every healthy marriage should also have boundaries.
Regardless of if there has been
and I think it's boundaries are safeguards. They are the parameters in which your relationship operates, and everybody's marriage is going to require different kinds of boundaries depending on your background, your past, some of the things that you've struggled with, maybe your thorn in the flesh. That way your spouse can help you, keep you accountable to your commitments and this covenant in marriage that you've made. And so for us personally, we want to say that we have created boundaries from the very beginning. And I think even when we talk about those boundaries, to some people, or at least to the world, it may seem extreme. Or even like, well, don't you trust your spouse? Or why would you do that? But like, let's say,
I trust my spouse, but I don't trust the devil.
Exactly. Because there are people that are ill-intentioned, and it's not necessarily them, but it's the spirit in them that wants to corrode. It wants to break things apart. I mean, that's what the enemy does.
That's what a familiar spirit is, actually. Yeah. So most people don't understand when it comes to spiritual warfare. Just like we have guardian angels, there have been demonic entities that have been assigned, not Satan himself, but lower level demonic entities that trace our life and our patterns. And I think that they're even ingrained now within technology, to where the algorithm knows you better than you know yourself.
They'll know exactly what you're into, what
you're
clicking.
It's not necessarily even a person, although the enemy may use a person. He'll use social media. He'll use all kinds of en routes to get you to your most vulnerable state. And so it's not about whether you trust your spouse, it's whether or not you trust the devil.
Yeah. And I think just creating those safeguards, like one of the things that I appreciate Ryan doing, number one, he doesn't drive with females by himself in the car. Number one, if it's a family member, but it depends, because some family members probably cannot be trusted as well. And that's nothing against my family or Ryan's family, but just those are just the safeguards that we do for our marriage that helps us keep us accountable, and for his good not to be evil spoken of. Because we have seen a lot of ministers even being accused of certain things because they have not had somebody next to them if they ministered to a female, or if they had conversations. Somebody can say things and blame them and say things that are not true at all.
And even when I was working a regular job and I had a female counterpart, we worked hand in hand. Even though there was never any idea or thought that there would be anything there. We did find ourselves on work trips in spaces where we would have to ride together from the airport to different locations and stuff. And I would always message Victoria, hey, just arrived, getting into the car. Hey, just arrived at the hotel. Made sure there was all kinds of over communicating that was going on.
Yeah, and I think it solidifies it for you. It makes your spouse feel comfortable, but for whoever hears it also that's sitting next to you, they're like, wow, that's amazing that they are building this really strong relationship, and nothing is worth breaking that. So it's almost like declares it out there when you create these kind of parameters that, hey, no, I'm not even entertaining this thought at all.
To not let your good be evil spoken of.
Yeah.
And
so these boundaries are good.
And it also means full access to your device, your accounts. It means, again, like we said, clear expectations for check-ins. It means committing to counseling, individual and to joint counseling or mediation. And it means inviting accountability partners into the scenario. And so for women, that would be finding other female companions that can help keep you accountable. But here's a couple things I want to say about accountability, because that can also become a scapegoat, right? Yeah. To say, well, I have all of these accountability measures and they don't work. Well, even with the best of accountability systems, they only work as good as you're willing to submit to them. Because if you want to sin, you will find a way to sin. And furthermore, I think you can have too many accountability partners. And I have found that there are individuals who set up a web in order to basically manipulate the system in order to like work and play against different people. I know this sounds crazy to some of you listening, but
we have experienced that.
When it comes to sin and finding a way of committing that sin, we go to extraordinary measures, and we're all guilty of it. I'm guilty of it. Victoria's guilty of it. And we have to say, okay, I'm going to find one good accountability partner outside of my spouse. I'm going to have this man have access to my data. There's all kinds of apps that you can put in place if you really want to, but even with those apps put in place, there's ways that you can circumvent them. So number one, have one, maybe two outside of your spouse. Keep it limited, safeguard yourself, and then submit to the accountability measures that you put into place. And finally, as it relates to that, making sure that you're not complaining about the boundaries. Some of these boundaries are going to be uber extreme, especially in the interim, until trust is built. And other measures are just going to have to be put in place for the rest of your life.
Yeah, for sure.
It's like for an alcoholic, the idea that, oh, I can have a casual drink here or there is just a trap from the enemy. If you've suffered with alcoholism, you have to commit yourself and say, I'm never going to have another drink for the rest of my life. And so the same is with whatever you're struggling with, whether it be sexual sin or financial sin, those accountability measures might have to be there forever. And on the other end of it, I think that if you are the spouse that has been offended, it's going to be important for you and for them to set some lines of celebration, to set some markers of accomplishment in your relationship, to say, okay, I look back and my spouse has been faithful and committed for 6 months. And at that point, being able to say, you know what, I'm just going to loosen up the strings, not to say the accountability measures aren't put in place, but you're not going to obsess about it in the way that you once did. You might, in the beginning, feel the need to get their phone at the end of every day and scour and search and do all of that. And maybe that's what has to be done in the beginning stages. But I think that if you're still doing that a year in, there's some deeper questions that you have to ask as to whether or not you've truly forgiven and whether you trust. And the trust isn't that that person isn't capable of doing it again, but even if they do offend you again, that the Lord is going to help you through it. That's the trust factor.
And trust is hard. It's like faith. You have to believe in the interim that your spouse is going to do what they have committed to do. And this is why we always say that you need to have those accountabilities set up. You need to have somebody that can speak into your life set up where you can come and talk through this and walk through this journey of healing, because that's what it is. And then create, like Ryan said, sometimes where, okay, we have walked through this for several months and they have stayed true to themselves. Like, how can we make them feel like it's a win? But also maybe you need personally an individual counseling to experience that healing, the true healing for yourself.
Yeah, because the reality is you're going to have to give yourself permission to grieve. Mm-hmm. You're allowed to feel confused and sad and even angry. But the Bible says, be angry and sin not. So if you find yourself suppressing these emotions, you are going to put yourself in a position where you're going to try to get them back. You're going to try to hurt them in the same way that they hurt you to make you feel
equal.
Yeah. Yeah. And forgiveness doesn't erase the pain instantly. The goal is healing, not pretending. So you want to be as honest as possible and say, I'm still hurting through this. Give me time. Holding on to bitterness is going to block your own freedom. Ephesians chapter 4 says, let all bitterness be put away from you. That's verses 31 and 32. And so the other thing that I want to say around that topic is that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting.
Yeah.
And I don't think even healing means forgetting. I don't think you'll ever forget what you felt when you found out that your spouse did what they did. Mm-hmm. And healing is being able to remember it, but being able to rewrite the narrative so that you view it from the context of forgiveness and love, unconditional love. And I think part of this is reminding yourself of you're a sinner who's been saved by grace as well, and Jesus has forgiven you. Again, this isn't permission for you to stay in a situation where there's habitual offense and betrayal. But I think that when you're talking about the majority of circumstances with couples, mm-hmm. it is a process of letting go and saying, I couldn't control what happened to me, but I can control what I do with my emotions. I can control with how I respond to this situation.
You know, and it's interesting because marriage is a very unique relationship. You have other relationships outside of your marriage, whether it's friendships or maybe family members. And I feel like those can be a little bit more simpler because if they betray you in some way or there's issues, you can always choose to say, I no longer want to participate in this relationship.
Right.
But your marriage is a covenant relationship. So God wants us to reconcile. He wants us to work together for his glory to be revealed, because it not only affects us, it affects the future generations. It affects our children. And so like the reason I brought up the relationships outside of your marriage, maybe like friendships or family things, is because sometimes a lot of us have walked through life and we've never learned how to walk through a challenging thing with a relationship. It's a lot easier for us to say, cut you off, that's it, not having any interaction.
And maybe this is the first time you've been challenged to stick it out.
Yeah. And like I would say personally for me, my relationship with my dad definitely shaped in the way I probably perceived a lot of relationships in my life. And because I've walked through a lot of resentment and bitterness of how that relationship played out, then I always approached every relationship with caution, and I could have probably approached it in a different way. Have I walked through that healing process versus kind of shut that stuff down and actually dealt with it, and maybe even confronted my dad on some levels. Maybe he wouldn't have admitted certain things, but I feel like that I would have been a lot healthier. But now that I know better, I think that helps me to say, is this stemming from my previous hurt? And so now I'm compounding this rejection and I'm walking through these issues with my spouse because I've experienced so much rejection. So now my response to what they did is so extreme because of my previous relationships and how I've managed them. So I just,
I know this is a random story and I don't even know if you want to share it. We can cut it out if you want, but I don't know if you remember one time when we were in Georgia and we went to a mall and we were walking down the mall and evidently I didn't notice it, but some guy grabbed you on the butt walking by or something like that.
Yeah.
And you just had this visceral reaction and you were running after somebody And I didn't even know what had happened.
It was so confusing.
Yes, it was so confusing. And I have a point to all of this. But we ran and I was like, Victoria, trying to stop you. What's going on? And you said, somebody touched me on the butt. And I was like, well, I don't. And then you were like, you saw him. He goes into this around the corner.
No, but he turned around and I think he was shocked that I was following him.
Yes.
And so he now is starting to run away. So that solidifies that he even did that on purpose.
Okay, so we get to him and we're standing in front of him and we realize that he's deaf.
But I feel like I personally think maybe he was even pretending.
I don't think he was pretending. He was deaf. Not that gave him an excuse for his behavior. But at the moment,
I wanted to punch him in the face.
Yeah, you wanted to punch him. And I think the other part of this conversation was, I think you expected me to have a more volatile reaction.
I think Ryan was so confused.
Maybe I was number one confused. But number two, like when I finally saw that this guy's deaf, I'm like, how is this going to look? We chased this deaf guy across the mall. And now what am I going to do? Beat the crap out of him because he touched you on the butt?
I'm telling you guys, that was the most violent. Like, it was so violating because Ryan either was holding my hand or he was holding my waist. So this guy, like, he was passing us, not like alongside of us. He was actually passing me and Ryan. And I, like, simultaneously as Ryan is holding my hand or my hip, I don't even know which one, but homeboy walked past and literally like grabbed my butt.
This is so random.
It is very
random.
I
remember you were upset at me for a while. I think that you felt as if I should have, I don't know.
Maybe you should have grabbed him and put him against the wall so that he learned his lesson.
Is that what you would have?
I don't know what I needed.
Maybe I would have if like he goes, he points at his ear and
deaf.
I'm deaf.
And I was
I'm
like,
sorry. That doesn't sound the nicest. I know. But still, it's a difficult
that was like another
situation.
shock to us too, because like we were like, I was blazing. I was ready to confront him. And then when he did that, I was like.
But I know that in your life, there have been scenarios where you overheard maybe conversations that your dad had with certain people.
Yeah.
And where they made a comment about your looks and he didn't really defend you in the way that he should have.
Yeah, he didn't like, I don't even know if he knew, maybe he was shocked himself, but like he didn't respond to it at all.
But that was to the point that you're making, which is like, what is the point that you were making?
I was making that like that affects the way you would react in the future if some kind of a betrayal happens to you. And again, I'm not saying that like if somebody had infidelity and it was because they were abused back there, that should excuse them for doing their behavior.
Right.
But I think when I understood the history of my dad and how he grew up, I think that's what helped me to forgive him and release him. It wasn't to excuse his behavior, as most people feel like that your dad should have done better and all that, for sure. But I think it helped me in my mind to reframe that my dad did the best he could, but I don't think he had the capacity for what I wanted him to do. And I had to release him of that because that was never going to happen. You know what I'm saying?
And you were able to love him and cherish what he was able to bring to the table once you reframed that.
Yeah.
And I think bringing it back to this conversation, I think you can have the same betrayal and two different responses based on an individual's background. So you have one spouse who is cheated on and they're able to get over it maybe more quickly than another because that one already had a seed of hurt and rejection from their past, and it means so much more. And I know that's hard to describe, but I think on the side of the victim, let's say, even though you aren't responsible for the bad behavior of your spouse, I think leaning into the moment and saying, well, my response, what does this speak to in terms of what's happening in my soul and what I've carried into this marriage? Ultimately, we want to get to the place where we are fully healed and whole to the degree that it's not going to shake my faith. It's not going to make me respond in kind with the same level of evil.
Yeah, for sure.
If that makes sense. Okay, for the one who was the betrayer, I want you to know it's going to be a long road, but it is worth it. Real repentance equates to changing the way that you think and allowing that to change your behavior. It's not just about words. You may feel like that you're over explaining in situations, like where you've been, what you're doing. It's going to be what it's going to be. You're going to have to swallow it and be humble. Consistency is what is going to build those broken bridges again. There's hope that we want to extend to you today. What the stats are saying, 60 to 75% of couples will recover, but specifically when they seek help, number one, and they set boundaries. I think that the percentage difference is like 20% on the other end compared to the 60 to 75% who recover and build back better, is that they are seeking help and they are setting boundaries. Yeah. And so that means within these success stories, there's voluntary disclosure, there's counseling, and there's commitment to rebuilding over the course of months and years. And real transformation is going to happen when both of you choose to do the hard work. I want you to be encouraged today. I want you to walk away from this episode feeling hope, no matter how challenging your set of circumstances are. And I want you to know that you're not alone. We have walked with many couples through this and they've come out on the other side better. And even people who we haven't counseled, we heard countless stories of people who have built really incredible marriages after betrayal. And so we want to leave you with that encouragement.
Yeah, for sure. Next week we're going to be talking about rebuilding intimacy, restoring emotional and physical connection after betrayal. And that's a big one, especially for those of you who feel like, when are we going to come to the other side of these issues that we have confronted? Again? Yeah, so
not just that's going to be, by the way.
Yeah, that's going to be a really good episode that you want to stay tuned. But if this episode has blessed you, make sure you share it with a friend. If you have not subscribed to this podcast, be sure to subscribe to this podcast. Again, reach out to us if you need help. Don't wait
That's right.
for too long. 864-428-7131, and we would be able to help you. Or if we cannot help you, we can definitely give you guys resources or connect you with a person that is going to be the right counselor for you.
And also, we are a nonprofit. We're a ministry. And so we do these podcasts and all of the ministry work that we do because of your support financially and your prayers. But would you partner with us financially? One time or even monthly would be great. Just go to empoweredcultureministries.org and sign up to become a partner and make a donation so that we can continue to provide these resources to you. And we're excited about other ministry expansion stuff happening with planting a church, with other resources that we're putting together. By the way, you can now go to Apple Store and your podcasts and Spotify and look up my brand new podcast. It's called
Breaking Through the Noise.
Breaking Through the Noise. And that's a teaching series, and I'm going to be bringing on some panelists. It's more discipleship focused, whereas this is more marriage focused. So go and subscribe to that. And
I think that's a great episodes to listen to, because it's just a personal development, and it's walking with Christ, but also understanding your belief system and maybe uprooting some of the wrong beliefs that you've had. And then, hey, you'll have an opportunity. Maybe Ryan can bring you guys on as well as a studio audience. So that would be
to be ministered to, prayer and prophetic. So this has been a great conversation today. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be back next week with another one on this series, When Love Gets Tough. It's all a part of Needed Conversations. We'll see you then.